As we press on through the end half of the 2020s, it's becoming more clear that the problems that have been plaguing us since urbanization and social media have basically gotten to an all-point high. And now isolation is kind of something people want to normalize. And not just normalize, they wear it like a badge. And there's nothing worse than an entire community or an entire city or large group of people who don't value the companionship of having friends, family, or anything else that, remotely keeps you from being alone or by yourself. And it starts to make you wonder if this is all some giant cosmic joke, because literally we're in an age of social media where everybody is connected across the globe. Instantly you can reply and speak to anyone from anywhere. You can instantly get in contact with people and see how everyone's doing, including your friends from high school, which I'm pretty sure a lot of you have, still on your Facebook or your Instagram. But yet, ironically, in the worst way possible, we feel more lonely than we have ever been. And these connections don't feel authentic. It's not the same as meeting somebody in, face to face and having a conversation with them or hanging out and going places with them, getting to know who they are, them getting to know who you are. And there's just not going to be anything that can replicate that experience of face-to-face interaction. So now a lot of people are pretty much lonely and they're straight up doom scrolling. They're doom scrolling. They feel like there's no one to help them, no one to give them a hand, no one to make them feel like they exist. And that creates a lot of problems, both physical and mental, surprisingly. And now it's pretty much gotten to the point where isolation and loneliness have ultimately become a public health crisis alert. So bad that pretty much it increases the risk of premature death by 30%. Now we have heart disease increased by 32% and stroke. And on top of that, even dementia increases by 50% just off of being isolated and alone. So it's not looking funny out here anymore. It's not a flex. And I'm not saying everybody needs to have friends all the time around them. There's times where you need to focus on yourself and just do what you need to do. And isolation in itself isn't always a bad thing, but I think it's when it's the only thing that it becomes a problem. As I typically believe everything is, fine in moderation for the most part. But when you have too much of one thing and you don't have the other to balance it out, what you ultimately end up with is an experience that's going to drain you both physically and mentally. And that's going to lead to some problems, whether you want to accept that or not. Even in my case, man, 7-8 months, I was literally by myself for the most part. I only recently just started reconnecting with my boys as of the last 3 weeks. And, it's definitely an experience that's hey, on one side, you get to self-reflect a lot more. You get to work more on yourself, in the sense of understanding yourself, understanding your thoughts, and also just working on your hobbies or your craft. In my case, I like to do music and I like to do graphic design on the side. It's good to have hobbies. And I hope you all have one of those yourself. But, at the same time, if it wasn't for my close family, my mother, my father, and my brother, I don't know where my mental state would have been, if I'm being quite honest. And once you really go down the rabbit hole of isolation and loneliness, you will eventually find disconnection. And once you finally become disconnected from everything and everyone around you, that's where you really start to spiral into this really dark place where now a few things might happen. You either might take out your frustrations on society, which leads to increased rates of crime due to mental health issues. Very much this is common in urban areas, or in the worst case scenario, that person's looking to delete themselves and they don't say anything. Most people don't say anything when that time finally comes. And unfortunately, If they don't make it obvious or they don't make an attempt to show themselves to the people that are closest to them, if they have any, that unfortunately will lead to a life lost. And so often it starts to make me question, that if urban environments are something that should have been a thing. One thing I did look up was that urban environments, naturally there's going to be more crime. But I think also the feeling of isolation that one experiences in being in densely populated urban environments is very suffocating. It's like, you've heard this saying of you can be in a large crowd and still feel alone. Well, look no closer than New York City, buddy, because that's where I'm from. And I can tell you that that is an honest fact. And so naturally with these large cities comes anonymity. And naturally that kind of leads to crime in the sense that you don't know anyone and nobody knows you. So you're not going to be held accountable as brutally as you would if you were in a rural area or suburban area where it's like, hey, the guy 10 houses over from you or some shit, In the city, nobody knows you. Like even the guy across from your apartment building, you probably don't even talk to, probably doesn't even know your name. So it's definitely a major factor I feel like nobody really considers when thinking about crime in cities, but also just the idea of like, hey, are metropolitan areas and large cities really like, something that should be accepted as normal or even desirable? And listen, if you love cities, I'm not bashing you or anything. I get it myself. You go down to Times Square in Manhattan, you see these large, beautifully well-crafted buildings just towering into the skies, the bustling, lively environments, the buildings shining like stars in the night. And it's amazing, man. It's really something that you don't feel, when you go to a suburban or rural area. And I think that's one of the great things about, cities at the end of the day is this grand scale. It makes you feel like it's an adventure. But if you have at least one or two people that you really feel close to and that you trust more than anything, don't be afraid to reach out, especially if you're really going through something. It's good to have at least one person that you can really talk to, and it doesn't have to just be a friend. It could be a family member, because isolation and loneliness is no joke, especially once you start feeling disconnected from everything. That's really where things start to get bad and you start to spiral. And when I say spiraling, you're probably gooning and subscribing to someone's OnlyFans, or you're consuming so much drugs and alcohol just to cope with the experience of loneliness that you're pretty much losing your mind in the process. And that ain't something I want for anyone. But this problem goes way back since the beginning of industrialization, man. Literally destroyed community. It destroyed the things that we generally hold dear when it comes to human interaction. Basically turning what used to be labor centered around families and general small towns and villages into large scale factories that just mass produce everything. And this was before social media came around and kind of made the issue even worse. But it's been there since certainly by the 19th century. And once we get to no doubt the early 21st century, but I would say primarily around the late 90s to 2000s, this is kind of where society kind of took a L and a lot of the problems we have today truly started to form. But industrialization was kind of like the thing that sparked, this destruction of community, this destruction of belonging and purpose. And outside of, in a way, destroying the nuclear family, it definitely did its part to isolate people. And everybody wanted to get in on industrialization at the time. So, well, they all went to these cramped cities to get in on the action. And that's kind of the start of where we are today. But I think, in short, you just can understand that somehow a lot of the time convenience can lead to destroying the foundation of unity, community, family, and everything that, holds the pillars of human interaction with one another, which is sad to say. And honestly, generally because, hey, it doesn't hurt to have things be easier, but at what expense? It's not like we have to deal with the hardships of our ancestors where it was literally humanity versus nature. And let me tell you, nature is no joke. Like the predators out there that we had to deal with back in those days during nomadic tribes and, trying to find shelter and moving from point A to point B, having to deal with lions and, giant apes that existed back then. Thank God we're not in those times. And I'm grateful for that. But at the same time, it feels like with everything that we get that's good in this world, there's always some kind of trade-off. And there seems to be this case that we need a perfect balance of community but convenience. But where do we find that? I'm glad we're not in the situation our ancestors were in. But at the same time, our ancestors definitely weren't suffering the loneliness and lack of purpose we have today. But on a final note, the last thing I'll say is the scariest part of this entire thing is that the elites, the rich and powerful, are actually pushing for this. If you don't believe me, you can look up the fact that people that are lonelier are easier to control and more likely to consume and purchase products, because they have no control. They're impulse buying because their lives are empty. They need something to fill the void. And they know that buying stuff will not fill the void, but it will add more bucks in their pocket. And it doesn't matter to them at the end of the day because, well, the rich and powerful, the elites, they don't care about everyday people. They benefit from destroying society so long as they get what they want, which is control over you. If we're being honest, it's not just about the money, it's about the control, which leads to that. Lonely, isolated people need to consume product to feel whole, but that is not the truth. That doesn't fill the void, that doesn't fix the problem. And they will constantly try to sell these things to you. That's why there's so many ads everywhere. Hell, they're thinking about adding stuff like that in the video games now where you have to watch ads. And if they do that, I swear I'm going to crash out. But yeah, even with the game I'm playing and showing you right now, Cyberpunk 2077, this is the truth. Like, these corporations don't give a damn. They are willing to destroy the world for their own selfish benefit. And they obviously know what's going on in the world. They know the problem, but they realize that the problems benefit them over the greater whole. And when you have rich and powerful people that don't care about anyone but themselves or the few people in their circle like them, well, we're all gonna have a bad time. Anyways, guys, be good out there and stay blessed. I'll see you later. Peace.